Last summer, 2020, everything was suck. I don't have to recap it all for you. My wife decided to bug out for a weekend up to my mother-in-law's, take the kids with her just to get some fresh air up in the north. And while she was there, my mother-in-law was clearing out some of her old possessions and some things that had even belonged to her in-laws. And we ended up picking up this excellent collection of old books for children. This is just a couple of them right here. Before we get into that, thank you all for subscribing. If you're subscribed, if not, please consider subscribing to this channel. I've really enjoyed and appreciated the growth over the last couple of months. And I'm hoping to hit 1,000 here real soon. That will allow me to do community posts, just text posts instead of doing an entire video. I'd be able to do a poll and you guys could vote on what kind of stuff you'd want me to review next. And then of course, comment below so that we can get conversations going. That helps to boost the video, make it more visible. And by all means, share it with your friends. So, homeschool, something that's become a lot more popular since the pandemic started. This book here, A Thomas Jefferson Education, is a very good resource on homeschooling, especially if you're doing it for the first time. It was the kind of thing that my wife and I had always talked about eventually doing for our kids, but we got comfortable in the busyness of life and just kept kicking the can down the road. Well then, last year happened, and we know that our kids are very social creatures and that they would do a lot better in an environment where they weren't cut off from their fellow students, like, seeing them 3-4 feet away, but not being able to high five, hang out, that kind of stuff. And so we just decided, well, why don't we do, homeschooling for the foreseeable future? Let's just jump into that. There's no better time than now. And, as things loosen up or progress with the whole pandemic bit, we'll do, co-ops and get-togethers with their friends that we know are okay, and just go from there. There were, a couple of ways that the public school system wasn't really working for our oldest son. I've got a lot of friends that are teachers and so on and so forth. A lot of fine people in the system. It just wasn't meeting our kids' needs, and so we decided to do a little bit more homework on that. And this book, recommended again, like I said, by a friend who's very, very successful in homeschooling her own kids. I mean, like her 13-year-old freaking is doing higher level high school math and speaks Korean and all that stuff. So it's like, yeah, I want to give my kid that kind of foundation, that bit of education. He talks about the way that people were educated in the past. Classically, they would have tutors, they would have mentors really, and they do a lot of their education just by reading on their own, studying old classics from their day, studying, old Greek and Latin writings, and then getting together and having discussions with their peers who had studied certain things and expanding their understanding of the world around them, learning from classical history, from classical philosophy. You kind of hear philosophy and you think, oh, it's this old stuffy thing that people learn in Argyle sweater vests in academies across the country. And philosophy is accessible to anybody. And more often than not, people have their own philosophy on things and just haven't really sat down to write it out, reason it all out. The point is that, we develop these things from reading, but the love of reading is kind of beaten out of us by high school. There's a staggering percentage of Americans that don't read books, after they get out of the public school system, because, they're subjected to a lot of books that just aren't all that enjoyable to read, and they're graded based on how well they agree with the teacher that gave them the book in the first place. So I'm kind of getting out into the weeds there on all that, but the point is, we got this treasure trove of old books from my mother-in-law, and it turns out these belonged to her mother-in-law. Let me see if I can get one of the cover pages in here. It still says Miss Knight. Knight was my wife's grandmother's maiden name, so it's been a while. The copyright date on some of these is, in the 50s. This one's in 66. It must be a different edition of it. But this one right here, The Men Who Sailed the Seas, that goes all the way back to ancient Greek sailors, and then into the Vikings and the Spanish Armada, a brief section on the Pilgrims. Then you get into the English, pirates, last of the sailing ships. These are very, very simple books. They're only about 60 pages and they cover the bullet points, but that's fine. That's why they're targeted at young readers, and they're even, accessible to somebody who's sitting down and just wants to kind of get the bullet points version of a particular event or period in history, because it gives you a very loose understanding, a framework within to work before you go to digest a much bigger biography. I mentioned in probably the video about when the Pilgrims met the Wampanoags about how I've read other historical books in my 20s and 30s that made me think like, oh man, I wish we could have studied this one in high school. Well, we couldn't have because we had to cover such a wide breadth of material that we couldn't really, focus more than 1 or 2 weeks on one particular incident or biographical figure. For example, the Wright brothers. There is, in fact, a book in this collection. Looks like it's been read a couple of times, The Story of Flight. And it looks like it won't just cover the Wright brothers, it'll also cover rocketry and even a brief glimpse into the sci-fi that they thought was going to be the future from the 1960s. I actually read a book that explains why we can't have rocket packs and flying cars. Long story short, road rage and breakdowns. It's bad enough on a flat surface. Imagine once you start getting people up into the air. Not great. But I thought this collection was really interesting. North American Indians. Who's the publisher on these ones? I believe it was Random House. One on Benjamin Franklin. I haven't read through this one, but I'm sure it'll touch on the whole bit with flying the kite with the key on it, learning about electricity. This one had the spine read off of it, this book on George Washington. Again, like, this will be a lot easier for my kids to read, to understand, who he was, why he was such a formidable military leader, and, what he did as president. That'll be a lot better than if they were to jump into, for example, this biography written by Washington Irving, who was himself, briefly, a contemporary of George Washington. In fact, that's who he was named for. But Washington Irving was still a young boy when George Washington died. But, I mean, imagine reading a biography written by somebody who actually met the man. There's another bio written by Ron Chernow, who wrote Hamilton, the nonfiction that Lin-Manuel Miranda's play was later based on. Chernow also wrote a biography on Washington that I've heard was very, very good, but I wanted to read this one first before I dug into that one. The point is, I wouldn't go throw this at my 8-year-old before throwing this one at him, because A, this is probably all the attention he's got, the attention span that he could handle for any particular subject. But if he's got that loose framework to build off of, later in life he might want to read something more substantial. What else have we got? Thomas Jefferson, Lewis and Clark. I've read a really, really good book on their expedition. I believe it was called Undaunted. Undaunted Courage. Undaunted was a different book. That's one that I'll do a video on later this summer. One on Andrew Jackson, incredible figure. Abraham Lincoln, of course, one of the 2 presidents they'll probably read the most about in public school. And in the last century, you got Teddy Roosevelt, a book on JFK. And 2 that I wanted to touch on here. These are the ones that I'm going to put up in the thumbnail. I don't imagine that Random House is publishing a whole lot of kids' books about Robert E. Lee or Christopher Columbus these days. Probably more likely Columbus than Robert E. Lee. I just thought it was kind of fascinating when my wife handed over these books, and I was like, oh yeah, there it is, see, Miss Knight. Especially not a book that would characterize him as a great American leader forced to make a terrible decision. While you can make that statement, and there's probably even an intellectual out there who could make it defensible, on the flip side of it, you'd find a lot of very loud voices, especially in this day and age, who would say no. I mean, that's why you've got all over the South and all over the country, any place that still has statues of him, those statues are getting removed. While I was looking through this collection and seeing that, and there's also, people are drumming up controversy about Christopher Columbus. As I was thinking, I want to read these books with my kids, and I want to discuss these figures with them, but I don't want to tell them what to think about them one way or the other. Now, I've read through a couple of these. Like I said, they're only about 60, 70 pages a piece. And they're written with a very positive perspective, but I'd rather they have a complete view of these historical events and these historical figures, because that's how you gain a more well-rounded education. I've thought a lot over the last year, especially with with this being a pandemic year, but with everything else that happened in 2020, and even as we speak right now, the Officer Chauvin trial is going on in Chauvin, excuse me, is going on in Minnesota. That's the George Floyd case. People are very, very passionate on either side of any historical event, but especially that one, to just name something recent. And passion often leads us to disregard facts, because once we're passionate about something, once we're emotionally invested in it, any statement that runs contrary to that which aligns with our passions then becomes something personal against us, and we don't want that, right? We as humans are passionate creatures, but we need to be able to take a step back and look at figures and events in history objectively. One of the greatest books that I read last year, and I read about 115 titles in 2020, and at the end of the year on my website on dreadpennies.com, I'll do a best of year list, and it sometimes rounds out to about 10, but if there's more, I'll do more. But out of those 115 titles, I narrowed it down to 10, and 2 of them were biographies about generals in the Civil War, and one of them was S.C. Gwynn's Rebel Yell, which was about Stonewall Jackson, who was one of the most effective military leaders for the Confederate States of America. Obviously the Confederacy lost, and it was good for the progress and preservation of liberty for all mankind in the United States that they did. However, to just chalk it up to Union good, Confederacy bad, kind of misses the transformation that the whole country went through throughout the course of the Civil War. And that's something that I learned from my reading. If you were to just get a basic public school education, they would teach the Civil War as these were the good guys, these were the bad guys, this was who won, this is what resulted from it. On a very, very plain and basic and even subjective level, yeah, you can make that declaration that the Union was good, the South was bad, and slavery ended as a result of the Civil War. But there was so much more to it than that. And taking that step back to take a complete view of who these people were, and more importantly, why they did what they did, it's just like, that's the most critical thing about studying history, is to learn from those who accomplished great things or those who made dire mistakes, to learn from it and say, how did somebody get into the mind space where they could decide that this was the right or the wrong thing to do? Nobody wants to go jump in front of a bullet and die unless they have a reason very consistent with their own personal value system that would motivate them to do so. 600,000 Americans died in the Civil War, and it went on for over 4 years. I mean, you've got to wonder why. And you won't really know unless you try to get in the headspace of these people on both sides. The other book that I read was Grant, also by Ron Chernow. Incredible book. I could do a half-hour video on that man. But anyway, coming back to my original point, talking about the homeschooling and the stuff I want to teach my kids, and the fact that a lot of people stop reading after they get out of public school. Reading is one of my first loves, and I'm not the world's greatest intellectual, even if I am the world's most literate truck driver. But we're the only species on this entire planet that passes knowledge from one generation to the next by writing it down on a piece of paper and letting it stand the test of time. I mean, I can still read stuff that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates wrote millennia ago and learn from their perspective. The whole point of learning history is to understand how the world got to where it is now, and what role I will play as a link in the chain to future generations. More immediately, I will see that with my children, with the way that they grow up and the things that they learn. I want them to learn how to have an objective understanding of people in the past and of events in the past. I want them to learn how to debate and discuss things respectfully, but to rely on facts or sources, and to be able to make a declaration consistent with their values, and to be able to defend their position. We used to be a lot better about that as a society, I think, but that might just be my personal bias, thinking that things were better in the past. I'll close by saying this. Several years ago, a friend of mine, Casey, and I, we were working at a demolition job. This was in Southern Nevada. I worked in the drilling and blasting industry. If you guys have ever gone back on my channel and looked at that video that says Skelebro doesn't look at explosions, that was at that job. But I made some of the best friends that I've ever made at work with the guys that were working there. And Casey and I were only semi-sarcastically kicking around the idea of starting up a life skills school to teach teenagers the stuff that we wished we had learned. You know, how to cook, how to perform basic maintenance on a vehicle, how to balance a checkbook, finance, and so on and so forth. But also, you know, how to hold a debate with somebody and understand that when your passions get heated, it's about the subject matter and not about the other person. You know, I'm an avid Christian. Casey was a very dedicated atheist, but that man has never said a cross word to me. We've never gotten in a fight. We've had a couple of discussions about things where we definitely didn't agree, but he's still one of my really, really good friends that I stay in contact with this day, you know, even to this day, even though, you know, he's gone on to another job and I've even moved on to another state. You know, you don't have to have the exact same values or the exact same thinking as somebody else to respect them and even have a good relationship and a good friendship with them. You know, we're heading into kind of a dangerous territory. We're neck deep in it at this point in this country, where, you know, the masses, I think, are just kind of cowed by what the loudest voices tell them to say, or tell them what they are allowed to think, or tell them what they have to think. You know, that's a very dangerous place to be as a society. I think it's better for us to read things on our own, to understand that out in the world we're probably going to learn things that run counter to what we want to be true, but we still have to accept facts as true. We still have to study people and give them a bit of grace, give them a bit of benefit of the doubt, and understand that we should be better about judging actions instead of just judging or condemning people. We'll never really know the mind of another person, and judgment doesn't really belong to us with regard to, you know, the mind of another person. We just need to be the best person that we can be good to other people, and you know, continue throughout the course of our lives to expand our understanding, to expand our knowledge, and leave a better world than we found. So that's my 2 cents for this week. 2 other books that I wanted to mention here real quick, and much like Rebel Yell, these will get their own video. You know, I briefly, you know, touched on the Christopher Columbus subject. Again, that's another figure that's, you know, kind of been targeted for erasure in terms of you know, historical study and everything. And I will absolutely, you know, not defend certain of the actions that he took after, you know, his discovery of the American continent. But I would highly recommend these 2 books by Charles C. Mann, 1491 and 1493. The 1491 book is a lot shorter. But this is basically, you know, a lot of what we know about the Americas before Columbus arrived. And this is a very, very fascinating study about how the entire world changed with the discovery of the Americas by the Europeans. Economy, agriculture, you know, language. We're not talking just geography and colonialism and stuff. We're talking about silver mined in South America affecting the economy in China, and you know, how I'm going to get out into the weeds if I start talking about all the very, very fascinating things that I learned from these books. But it's nonfiction like this that has really made me an avid student of history in my adult years, more so than I was in my teens. I thought the highlights were interesting in history class. It was cool to learn about the Wright brothers. That's another book that I need to get, the one by David McCullough. But you know, everything was surface level, and I spent the rest of my time reading comic books and fantasy novels and all that stuff, and I still do. But you know, having a love of reading and of studying history and you know, learning all of that comes from finding the right books to read, or very, very good books to read. So I'll close on that note, and hopefully that's given you a couple of book recommendations to look into for now. And if you got any questions, comments, like I said, by all means, leave a few words down below and we'll get a discussion going. And in the meantime, I will find something for us to talk about next week. Take care.